Welcome back. Once again, we're going to pick up where we left off and talk about leveling resources. So, just going back to my Gantt chart here for a moment. Just as a rule of thumb, when you are programming for unlimited resources, you want to get something that is a realistic assessment of the resources needed to do a job as you go. Granted, it's unlimited in terms of your approach when jobs are clashing, but generally with construction, and certainly in commercial construction, a good rule of thumb would be that none of your durations should be longer than 10 days. It's highly unusual, certainly on a commercial construction job, to find a job that goes for more than 2 weeks before another trade is wanting to get in there. So generally, when I'm working out durations, and I'll go through durations and calculation of durations in other videos, so I won't go too deeply into it here, but you control the duration of the job based on how much work there is to be done and what resources you need to do it. So in the case of bricklayers, as an example, straight off the top of my head, a team of 2 bricklayers will lay 1,000 bricks a day. Therefore, if you have 6,000 bricks to lay, one team of bricklayers will do it in 6 days. If you need it to be done quicker than 6 days, then 2 teams will get it done in 3. So the amount of resource you can put against the task will reduce the duration in the main. 2 excavators can dig a hole faster than 1 excavator. However, that said, putting 10 guys in a trench doesn't necessarily mean you'll get a pipe laid quicker. So you have to temper it with the realities of them having room to work beside each other. So throwing more resources at a job doesn't always reduce the duration. Sometimes it'll increase it because of trying to force too many people into one space and it becomes less productive. So you have to take a sort of realistic, pragmatic view. But generally, if you assume that a maximum of 10 days, if you're, let's say, laying concrete and foundation trench and you've got 3 weeks worth of concrete in foundations, generally you'll see that written up in a program, something like 3 weeks for concrete, and there'll be a finish to start relationship with minus 10 days, so that brickwork can start a week later or something like that. Trying to do it that way is generally an indicator you don't have enough detail. And you're trying to cram too much work into one trade, because what you're really saying in that kind of scenario is if the bricklayers can start a week following the start of concrete, that means that there's enough work done in a bay of concrete work in a week that another trade can cross over. So really that's telling you that the concrete trade should be split up into weekly segments of work or bays, and other trades can cut across. And that's what you're looking at, is trying to aim for the most efficient way and covering enough detail to show how things are happening. That way, if there's a problem with one section of work, it's easy to show where the problems lie and apportion it in the right spot. But again, I'm sort of going off on a tangent here. Let's get back to this. Right, where was I? Now, we're looking to get rid of all of these over allocations, and we've set the team sizes. So if I go back into my team planner, because this is where we're going to work this out. So a battens contractor, I've got one team of battens contractors. Now, as I'm looking at this, it's each of these tasks is essentially a 2-day job. So no matter what I do, if I move this out by half a day, 3/4 of a day, now these are setting both at the same time. Now I've moved this one from further back, so what I should do now is move this one out to allow that. So what I've effectively done is I've delayed this job by 2 days and I've delayed that job by 2 days. And 1 to 2 days delay, if you work on the basis that 90% of all tasks are not on critical path, so 90% of all tasks have some amount of slack, some obviously more than others, but generally there is generally something to play with before you affect the critical path. So what you're trying to do is minimize the amount of impact. And by trying to minimize the amount of impact, what you're doing is trying to rearrange work so you get the most efficient way of working and the minimum move out of the program. Now, with this here now, we're saying with the bricklayers, we've got 2 teams of bricklayers. And we can see that one of the teams starts a day before the other. So team 1 starts, then a day later, team 2 starts. Now, we could potentially, as we're standing here looking now, I can move out the 3rd job, which is the clash, and I could move it out by a little more than a day. And that takes away the clash, and that finishes the job, as you can see here now, on the 3rd of September, which is the Friday. But potentially we could tighten this up a bit more by looking at how the resources are apportioned. Because this is one team and I've got 2 teams to call on, if I double click on this task, it brings up the task information box, and if I go into resources, we can see we've got 1 team of bricklayers working on it. If I change this to 2 teams, obviously I'm going to shorten up how long it takes to do the job. And you can see now that's now taking a day and a half, not 3 days. And if I do the same with the 2nd team, the 2nd job, because I get them all working together, into the resources, change that to 200. And there's just a little bit of overlap there, so I need to push out by what looks to be like an hour or so. And because I've got now 2 teams working on this, if I do the same with the 3rd, lot 3, and change the resources to the 2 teams working together, and now push that out, obviously there is still a push out. But if I now look at this says now we are starting on the Tuesday and we're finishing on Wednesday, the 1st of September. So by thinking about how I apportion the work and who gets assigned to it, I've actually managed to save a couple of days rather than lengthening the program as much as it would have done. It would have moved out to finish on Friday, and I'm actually finishing on Wednesday. So the impact is far, far less. And that's what we're looking to do all the time. How can we improve the efficiency to save time and make the impact of a push out much less? Now we've got the same thing here. We know we've got carpenters. We've got 2 teams of carpenters available. Now you can see here I've got a lot of work for basically 3 teams as we go in. But I could, because I've got a day here, I could, by double clicking on this and going into the resources, I could say I can put both teams on this to start, which will shorten up and has made a bit of difference. But whatever I do here, I'm going to be pushing out, and what I'm trying to do is minimize the impact wherever I can. So at the moment now, because I've got 2 teams, I've got this task happening and this team happening, so I've got both teams are basically fully occupied over this period. So all I can do is actually push out and just see. If I push out a half day at a time, you'll see it sort of dynamically changes to rearrange the work. And what I'm trying to do is minimize the impact of my changes so that my 2 teams are fully, and you can see here I'm only moving it by half a day, 3/4 of a day, but obviously you'll see at the far end things are pushing out and changing, but the program is actually trying to make it as efficient as possible and to fill in the gaps. So here now, if I move that to here, I've literally just got to keep moving things along to keep everything as tight as I can. And so there. cladders are moving along, but you can see what I'm doing is essentially just trying to push the things that were expected to happen later. So I'm almost doing it like a broom, pushing things towards. Now there's a bit there, just literally just trying to minimize the impact every time. Now you can see I've got a gap there. I say, okay, what if I move this forward? It tells me that I would have to break a link to make that work because this is being driven by something else. And what it's saying is I'm trying to move it too early. So click OK and just move this over allocation on again a little. And as we just work our way through. Now bear in mind that all of these changes, every time I move something out, it's having a ripple push-on effect to the other tasks downstream. And by the other tasks downstream, I'm not just talking about this trade. If, say, bricklaying was supposed to finish on Monday and the next task was going to start on Tuesday, which could be carpentry, if the brickwork gets moved out to finish on Wednesday, then the carpentry can't start till Thursday. And if the thing following carpentry was, say, roofing, then the roofing would move. So all of these things as you move are actually rippling through all the way down. And the effect gets carried forward. Now, I've gone through there sort of 3 or 4 weeks leveling out the carpentry. This will be creating clashes in its own right against the other things. So we've got to really start at the beginning and work these towards the back, basically from the start, and do it right through. And we'll probably have to go through these a few times because every time you make a change in one trade, it will affect other trades. So now let's move back up to the top and just work our way through from basically from the start, looking for any over allocations at the start or beginning of the job. And all I'm basically doing is just skimming along so that, as I said before, so that we are actually pushing any problems ahead of us in terms of, and I'm looking at all of these resources at the same time rather than filtering them down, because I want to look for issues that I can deal with as I go. So we have a few there. Okay, so ceiling battens contractor, only one of them. So I have, now again, you can see here I've just got a day of push out, which is not too bad. And again, with the fascias contractor, I've got a day of push out, and that's dealt with those. So we'll move along sort of a few weeks. So there, say, now you can see we've got cladding and we've got dry linings, chipboard, window fitters. We've got 2 teams of window fitters. So jib fixes there. I've got a day of push out there again. So again, not a massive effect. Secondary cladding. So I've only got 1 team of cladding guys. So my option is really here nothing other than to move out. And is this lot 3? Yes, I've got no option there, but that will have to move out by over a week to push that out. That's because I've only got 1 cladding team. So really, if I've got a week or more where I'm having to push out like that, then ideally I would be looking for a 2nd team of cladders, because a week to 2 weeks of push out is a big effect. And as part of my trying to minimize the risk on the job, I would be looking at doing that. Now, just to sort of see where that has taken us, if I'm going to Control Z back to get back to where we started with that. Okay, so jib linings, that was my last thing. So moving up now. If we look at the project statistics now, we're currently showing, so the changes we've made so far with pushing out the carpenters, that originally we were looking at finishing on the 3rd of November. Now we've added a week, the 8th of November. So just to see what kind of effect we're having by doing this, see, we've added 10 days basically to the project because of that. Now, that's a massive risk. And I don't know, let's say typically on a housing estate, if you're doing a housing estate for, say, somebody like Kiangarora, which is the old house in New Zealand, or some other sort of governmental thing, the typical penalties for late delivery would be around 1,700, 1,750 a week. Now, adding 2 weeks has basically just cost you $3,500 in basically push out, if you had a contract that said we had to be finished by, our shortest time. So the effect, it's not so much the effect in terms of the progress of the work. The risk you're looking to reduce is the risk of overrun, because the risk of overrun is massive. As I say, if it's 1,700 a week and you've added 2 weeks, then there's 3,500, but you also have a running cost of the site to consider as well, because that's a push out on that. So you want to keep everything as tight as you can. So what this is telling you, even if you have to pay more to get a second team of cladders, then you're worth spending the money. So I just close this. I'm going to leave it sit at the moment, because we said at the start that we've got one team of cladding, but this identifies a big risk. And this would, if you were a project manager or a site manager, this is the kind of thing you would be looking to tighten up on. I'd be looking for ways of how can I tighten this work so that I'm doing this push out. Having said that, if we are in a tender position at the moment where we haven't actually agreed the contract yet, what we're doing is we're working out the reality of how long we think the job is going to take. And remember what I was saying before about the unlimited resources being our backstop position. I'll talk a bit more about that later on when we look at the effects and things, but just keep that in mind. Okay, so just again, I'm just reviewing back through to look for any clashes. And at the moment, if we're looking at all of these resources, you can see there are no clashes for them at the moment. The clash now appears to be purely on painters. So if we look at painters, I've got 2 teams of painters. So once again, on the assumption we can't get more teams of painters, okay, I've actually just accidentally tried moving that forward. Before I go any further, let's have a look at where we're sitting. Currently, we're looking at 19th of November as a finish date. If I now start looking to even this out, and now the painters are, there are no clashes in painters, but let's have a look at what it's done to our finish date. So we've just added another week there, because we were on the 19th, we've added another 6 days. And you can see now our total variance against where we started is 16.5 days. That's just over 3 weeks. Now, scrolling through, that would appear, oh, we've got a bit of a clash on cleaners, which we just need to move along on. It's a little half a day. Scrolling through now, okay, so we have no more resource clashes. If I go back to my Gantt daily chart and close this down, here's the effect of the resourcing is having on my program. So the black line was my original baseline program. So if I scroll back up to the top very quickly. So here we are starting. And straight away, because of the resources we've got available to do the work is having to stop and wait. And as we run through, you can see the effect. As we get further and further out, further and further down the program, the effect becomes more and more. Now, one thing you need to be aware of in this, you can see now that the critical path, such as it is now, is showing primarily on lot 2. In fact, the garden's in lot 2. But if I filter for critical, what you're likely to find is the critical path isn't complete. And you can see here, external painting, this is all that's showing now as my critical path, and that picks up. If I go back into my statistics, the baseline start was 28th of June. My current start is still the 28th of June, but you notice my critical path now is only starting to show up on the 6th of October. And the reason for that is every time we have to wait for a resource, we're putting gaps into the program, because we're interrupting the chain sequence of work happening in its logical availability. So if something could have started on Monday, but because of the lack of resource, we can't start it until Thursday, what we've actually done is introduce in 3 days of gap, which effectively become 3 days of slack on that chain of work. So the critical path essentially goes out the window, because critical path is any task that has 0 days of slack. Now, to show you what I'm talking about, if I insert a column here for total slack, you can see there now my critical path is showing 0 days. If I press F3, and bear in mind here now, line 160, painters, exterior clad in lot 2, is the top of my critical path at this point in time. When I remove the filter for the critical path, we'll go and look at line 160 and see what basically is happening at that point. So if I hit F3, I remove the filters. If I now hit F5 and type in 160, that will take me to line 160. So there's my top of my critical path. Now, if I just open this out a bit so we can see what's going on, I only have one task leading into it, which is the cladding. And you can see now, because the cladding is having to wait, because if you remember, cladding was one of the ones I said was a big risk because it was pushing out by a lot. I've got 0 days of slack, and because of the cladding, there are 4.5 days of slack in the cladding because the painters are not available until that point. So the cladding is happening, but the thing that's pushing it is the painters. If you see these little calendar markings here, if I hover over it, you'll see that it's got to start no earlier than 6th of the 10th, which is that date there. That's because the painters aren't available to do this work until the 6th of the 10th, because they're elsewhere on a different lot. But there are actually 4.5 days of slack in this, and there are 13 days of slack in the brickwork. So what this is telling me is, and you can see it here, this is where the critical path has gone, is the critical path has been swallowed up by these gaps. Now, we can get that back to an extent by changing the way in which the critical path is calculated. And that is going to be the subject of the next video. So see you soon.